Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charles Rumford. I'm a principal infrastructure architect at DEFT and a member of the program committee, and I'll be moderating this session this afternoon. I'd like to introduce Matt Ringel, who will be presenting Whiteboarding 101. Matt is joining us from Boston. Matt has presented numerous times at NANOG, with his first presentation being in 2003 named Knock Theory in Practice. Please welcome back to NANOG, Matt, and it's a pleasure to have you back with us as always.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I bet you wonder why I called you all here today. I'm gonna make you an offer you can't understand. So what we're gonna be talking about today is, right, like it says on the tin, Whiteboarding 101. How to give a talk on a whiteboard. What it means to actually deal with the subtle art and interesting science of narrative, of combining a lecture, me talking to you, and narrative, me telling a story, along with the visual input, the constantly evolving visual input I'm putting on here. Okay, it's kind of cool. It's a smaller board than I expected. I can peer over it. It's great. So here's what we're going to do. A couple of ground rules. This is a 90-minute talk. That's long, I'm aware. So here's what we're going to do. I've got a little clock in front of me down here. Somewhere around 40 minutes in, give or take, I'm going to give you a 5-minute break. At that point, empty your brains a little bit, check your email, more than you're checking it now. I'm not made of stone, I know. Because this is all going to be about talking to humans. We're playing this game with humans. And I want to show you a few of the rules on the back of the box. But so we're going to take a 5-minute break, come back, have about 3 minutes of Q&A, carefully timed, and then we'll continue with the rest of the presentation, and then will be a longer Q&A at the end. So you will get, if you have questions in your head and you're holding on to them for dear life, I promise you, you will get them out so you don't ignore the second half of the talk when you're still holding on to that question. Because I'm kind. So, without further ado, let's begin. Yeah, so one of the things that's interesting about a whiteboard, right? It's just you, hopefully some functioning markers. Please get functioning markers. They actually had to give me a new set right before this talk. You, the markers, an eraser, hopefully, please don't use your hand, and some charm and a story to tell that hopefully you've rehearsed. This is a lecture. I have rehearsed this lecture. I've rehearsed this lecture several times. There are improvisational bits to it, but in general, this is something I've talked about and know how to structure. And that is your first lesson. Rehearse. Know how to structure your talk. Because the way that you're going to talk about things, the way that you think about things, the way you're going to relate things to your colleagues or your friends around whatever favorite beverage you have, is not the same way that it gets from your head into everybody's heads here. So we're going to talk about that as well. The interesting thing about humans, really, is that we structure stuff through narrative. We talk about stuff through stories. The way I know that the mammoth is over there is by you telling me. The way I know how to kill it is by the person who survived coming back and actually telling us how to do it. And so on and so forth. Including war stories about how you should please remember to type, commit confirmed. And so in the end, the way that we organize stuff is associatively. Oh, that reminds me, I remember this, I remember that, I remember this other thing. And so we tell things in terms of stories. And so what you're going to hear is a set of small stories today about how to get information into people's heads without surgery. So the first thing I want to get you to is boundaries. We all have good boundaries, right? So, boundaries. What does this actually mean? Well, let me draw you a little picture. I've got a whiteboard. I can draw pictures. Think of this, think of your horizontal boundary, or your x-axis actually, as kind of time and scope. What do you want to talk about? What do you want to cover? Think of your vertical axis. I said don't use your hands. I lied. I'm sorry. As abstraction. What level are you going to talk about this thing at? How many details are you going to include? How deep into the weeds are you going to go? Sometimes that's necessary. Everybody has to agree informed consent is key. And in this particular, or maybe it's just a high-level overview. You've got a relatively non-technical audience or a very, very varied audience, and you just need them to understand the basic concepts so you can have discussions later. Right? This is a repeated game. But the important thing is to choose a band of abstraction. Now, what do I mean by that? Intentionally, and with intent, think of what level you want to discuss this talk at. What level you want to have, what level of detail you desire to use for whatever talk you're going to do. Are you going deep into the weeds upon like voltage and Ethernet specifications? Are you going on about the way the global internet will change the world of tomorrow? No. Point is that there is a level in which you can stay. And the peril is that if you break out too high, well, now you're hand waving and everybody's bored because I came here for a technical discussion. If you break out too low, now you're caught in the weeds and nobody actually has any idea what you're talking about. And they're bored and they're busy going to check their email because they're waiting for you to come back to them from the thing that you promised that you were going to discuss before you got so fascinated with yourself that you decided to have a nerd fight with everybody in the room without them consenting. So, first step, set the boundaries. A nice part about this, though, so here's the thing. You get a free pair of ears with every mouth. If you're talking, you can listen to yourself. This is pretty cool, right? If you're talking, you can listen to yourself. And so, you can be constantly checking to see whether you are getting into the weeds. You can be constantly checking, because you know what you're listening for. You know the details you're listening for. You've done it 2 billion times, talking with friends, going, oh, I'm sorry, I got a little bit excited there. Or, hey, I got a little bit, kind of, 3 a.m. dorm room philosophy, and that was a little bit weird too, man. I'm sorry. But the point is, you can listen to yourself and say, I went a little bit far afield. And at that point, you can say, what do you do at that point? Don't say, hey, I'm sorry, I got too far out of the way. You're up here. You're the expert. You are allowed to make mistakes, but the bottom line is, be professional about it. Just say, just stop where you were, finish the thought. Don't cut off the conversation. Finish the thought, let it come to an end, and then drag yourself back to the topic. And just come back to what you were talking about. Hey, there's this really, really interesting thing that happens with marsupials, but and it's really, really fun and what happens with the eggs and stuff, but and let me tell you how this relates back to my Safari card collection. I'm old, sorry. So the point is, and I say the point is a lot, I know that. See, listening. Is figure out, listen while you're talking. Listen to whether you're going to the weeds or not. Listen to whether you're going too high up. Bring yourself back, keep on going. But this requires you to have thought beforehand about what level of abstraction you want to speak at, which goes back to the first thing I said, which is rehearse. Think really hard about what you want to talk about, what you want to present, and what you want the people in this room, or in the other room, to walk out knowing and thinking about. That's the goal. So, next, I'm going to talk about what it means to frame a discussion. What does it mean to actually set those boundaries with your audience right away so they're in the right frame of mind? So one of the best ways to do this is, first, how did I greet you this morning? I said, or this afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. We're going to have a talk here on Whiteboarding 101. Boom. We are now humans in a lecture. I'm the one talking. I explained a couple of ground rules. And now you're listening, and I am talking, and you know when you will have a break, when you will get to ask questions, and to not ask questions beforehand. And a set of like 15 other implicit social norms that come along with that. But it's kind of cool. That's all in your heads already from being working professionals. So let's talk about a few other things that are also in your head. Okay. This is like my favorite one. How many people have seen the Gartner Magic Quadrant for anything? Or like business school, the Foursquare? That's pretty much everybody in this room, give or take. If you have been near business school, if you have been lightly exposed to anything of that era, you have seen this Foursquare thing. And typically it has, axis A here, axis B here. This is less, this is less, this is more, this is more. And then you have 4 alternatives in there, right? So what does that mean? Well, there are about 6 or 7 assumptions that you have now locked into your heads as a result of that thing. Check this out. Ready? Number 1. There are 4 specific different things. There's 4 specific different things. 2, they are all sufficiently distinct from each other that they are worth discussing separately. 3, there are 2 variables, and only 2 variables that are relevant. 4, there are only 2 settings of those variables that are actually relevant. Now, those are the obvious ones. From there, we can talk about there's probably 1 that's implicitly good and 1 that's implicitly bad and 2 that are implicitly neutral. So that's 5 right there. I'm sure that if you're thinking about this and you're not the one continuously churning over the lines in his head to give for this talk, you'll probably think of a few more by the time this talk is done. But I was able to leverage that image that's in your head. And you have now slammed down a whole bunch of assumptions that go with it that allow me to give you a better talk because we all are speaking the same language. Let me give you another example. Zero, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. A number line. There is a single dimension. There are specific distinct points on it. Depending upon, there are 2 endpoints, which are the only things which, and this represents the scope of what we're going to consider, and nothing outside of here exists. Depending upon how I draw the dots, there might be an exact middle, or there might not. And that in itself is information. So now we're talking about a continuum of one thing, one variable regarding another topic. And that is also all in your head already. If we were to go even further than that, we can talk about stuff like, well, they gave me a purple marker. This is great. Graphs. Everybody's familiar with the startup, Dreamland hockey stick graph, or the diminishing return asymptote graph, or our favorite, the normal distribution. Each of those, being working professionals in a certain field, means things to you. You know this means exponential growth. You know this means diminishing returns or nearing some optimum. You know this means, okay, the average is going to be here, and we're going to see about 66% inside here and 95.3% outside there, la 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 la. And now we get to have it, and I don't need to describe what a bell curve is to you. Oh yeah, just because I see somebody doing it in front, feel free to take pictures of the whiteboard. That's part of the whole point of this exercise. It will be recorded, but if there's things that work for you, please do. I don't have to describe to you what a bell curve is. I might have to describe to you what more complicated distributions are, chi-square, Poisson distribution, etc. But I don't have to describe that one. I don't have to describe this either what it is or rhetorically in terms of every startup dreams of having this thing and here's why that doesn't work and 90% of startups fail and blah, 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 blah. Don't have to go into it. But it's there and we can do it. So in terms of framing the discussion, so I've told you a little bit about images. You probably have a bunch of other images. There's clearly not an exhaustive set that you can think of that you can just use that are just going to pull images from people's stuff that you can start using right away. Use them. They are there. They are tools. They work. So what comes next? First thing. Oh yeah, helpful safety tip, because this is actually important. You see I'm using a bunch of different colors here. Number one, make sure you have fresh markers. Like I said, I just had a new set delivered this morning, like I think 5 minutes before this talk. The other thing is always cap your markers. Dry erase, without going into the deep chemistry of it, because that's totally not relevant, is basically colored solvent when you get right down to it. Those things will dry out incredibly fast. And they'll dry out faster if they know, because they're watching you. And so if you have it uncapped for more, if you're gonna have it more than 3 seconds uncapped, cap the marker. You can always take the cap back off, and this way you don't have a dried out marker and you end up throwing it in the trash or at somebody, even worse, not very professional. So always, please, always cap your markers. That helpful safety tip aside, framing discussion. So one of the most interesting things about this is you get to set up an initial point of reference. It's kind of like, okay, show of hands. If I talk about price anchoring, who knows what I'm talking about? Price anchoring, a couple of people. I'm being charitable. What we're going to do here, it's like, for example, I say, I want to sell you this eraser. This eraser is $10. Bidding starts at $10. Who wants it? Now, of course, this eraser is clearly not worth $10. But the point is, I've told you this starts at $10, and so we started negotiations at $10 because, well, that's where they start. Why? Because somebody said so. And then all discussions start from that point. It's like a salary negotiation or anything else in that regard. The first person to say a number anchors that discussion to things from that point. Same thing goes for whiteboards. Same things for whiteboard discussions. The problem that you put forward, or the assertion you put forward, becomes the thing that becomes the point of discussion. For example, enterprises are reconsidering being in the cloud. What the hell did I just? Number one, we're talking about enterprises, clearly. Number two, we're talking about the cloud. Number three, we're talking about they were in the cloud, or they are in the cloud, and they're considering not being in the cloud. That's all water under the bridge. That's all done already. The only discussion now is how much should they move out of the cloud? That might be not at all, that might be everything, but we've already said it's enterprises, we've already said it's the cloud, and we've already said it's about moving out of it. And there are no other discussions we're having here. Another one is, there are 4 fundamental types of bots and scrapers. Well, we're talking about bots and scrapers, and there are 4 fundamental types, and they're all distinct from each other, and they're all worth talking about, and I might even put them on a 2x2 quadrant because I have that tool with me. But my favorite one is from an ad campaign. Less filling, tastes great. This was one of the most brilliant pieces of ad work done at the time. Why? Because a beer company decided, I don't want people talking about other beers. I want people talking about how to enjoy my beer. I'm taking other beers off the table. The only discussion here is what you like about my beer. And by tying it to a single beer and saying, less filling tastes great is about that beer. Note, I'm not actually saying that beer because it's one of three and they keep getting mixed up in my head because they're all basically the same as far as I'm concerned. I'm opinionated. The bottom line is you have now limited the discussion and the scope to how am I going to enjoy American Light Lager number 2A? And that is brilliant in the way that you narrow down discussion and you anchor it to a specific point. So a note about color when we're talking about whiteboard markers. Like I said, I'm using a few colors, mostly black because it shows up the best, but there's times to use others. So, show of hands, how many people here have done basic accounting? Basic accounting, most of you. How many people here have done basic electrical work? Most of you. Okay, great. So, in accounting, if I talk about negative numbers, I typically cover them red, maybe in parentheses if I got only one color of ink. Talk about positive numbers, typically talk about them in black. That's where Black Friday comes from. That's when retailers get to be in the black. Blah, blah, blah. That's one of the apocryphal things, but it's mostly true. Great. So what happens with electricity? You all know, so we're just going to do it, right? Always cap your markers. That will trip you up more times than not, and not just for accounting electricity either. But just remember, not everybody is going to process color the same way, and that's not just subject matter. Given the amount of people in this room and the mix of people here, there are at least three, possibly, there are probably 3 people in this room who are red-green colorblind, or some form of colorblind. Most popular form is red-green. Red and green both kind of look like gray. They're kind of identical. They are indistinguishable, give or take. Using red or green, well, that makes sense. Red means up, green means go. That's why traffic lights are always positional. Red's at the top, green's at the bottom, because that's an accessibility thing. Or to the left, or red's at the left, green's at the right. There are other colors you can use. What you'll find is if you go into color blindness mode for various graph applications, what have you, you'll see they'll switch to, instead of red or green, they might go to blue or yellow. They might go to a few others. There are apps out there that are relatively cheap that will allow you to simulate different kinds of color blindness. That's all I'm going to say about that, but the fact is it's important. Don't think that colors mean exactly what you think they mean, even in an audience that is culturally from most people here from the US, middle class professionals, blah, 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 are basically the same in that regard. There are other things you need to be thinking about, and just keep those in mind. So, we're fine on time, that's great. So a couple of exercises for you. One thing that I was taught, so I was, back when I was at Akamai, I was in professional services for 5 years, which means I gave a lot of whiteboard talks. And one of the things I was taught know 10 to teach 3. You have to know about 3 times as much about your subject in order to teach some basic level of it. Because you don't know where people are going to go. Now, is that actually statistical proof there? No, but I love the phrase. There will be no footnotes. So what you can do is you can say, okay, I want to teach this. How much more about this do I know? If someone decides to say, well, what happens over there? You go, I don't know, as it turns out. That's a great question. It also means that when you find yourself with a missing bit of detail in your talk, because you probably didn't rehearse it word for word, you'll be able to fill it in from your knowledge and not hand wave it away and start losing credibility. So make sure that you know enough over and above what you're talking about to be able to talk about it. That doesn't mean tiny little details, but that just means think about, if you've probably seen other lectures on it, what other questions are asked. If you actually like type it into a web search, what are the first random questions that come up that are relevant? You know, think like that. These are the things that are going to come up when people talk about them. Hopefully, most of the time. But this also means know 10 ways to describe a thing. To teach 3 ways of describing a thing. You need to be able, everybody works differently. The metaphor that works for one person isn't going to work for somebody else. So think really hard about what you're going to use, how you're going to describe, you know, the TCP three-way handshake, as an example. I just said handshake, right? Okay, everybody thinks about, hey, we're going to talk to each other. That's great. Other thinks of it as ak, other thinks of it other ways. But in the end, if you have enough metaphors for how to think about it, the more people in your audience are going to get it in the end. And this could be varying metaphors during the talk. So in addition, so think about when you're prepping a talk, how many ways can I describe a thing? Just run that exercise with yourself. How many ways can I describe this phenomenon? Well, you know, it's like 2 people talking to each other, or it's like knocking on a door, or it's like driving a car, riding a bike, or stuff. And, well, that's where I put the eraser, and another one, which is actually another thing I learned from professional services, is drill yourself. On what? If you have this topic, how would you describe the topic in 2 minutes? If that's all you had. 1 minute. 30 seconds. 10 seconds. 10 seconds is a surprising amount of time. To a colleague. To someone, to a novice, to someone who just isn't technical. Take your pick, right? How are you going to describe it to them? And look yourself in the mirror and say, I'm going to describe it to you this way. That's going to help you too. So after that, next thing, sorry about this, there you go. Words mean things. The way that I have of getting information into your head is by talking about it. That's what I got from up here last time I checked. So how am I going to talk with you about something? What is the vocabulary? Once again, intentional, think about it, rehearse. What is the vocabulary I am going to use to talk with you about a subject? We can go through, I'm not going to go through political examples here, there's not the place for it. But you can probably think of plenty where it's just the way you describe something politically describes what side of it you are on. If you're talking about digital rights management, you could be talking about digital restrictions management. You could be talking about, you know, you talk about pay-per-view, you talk about pay-to-play, you talk about whatever. But in the end, you know, if you're talking about OTT or those rat bastards stealing our revenue, the point is that, I see who's with the OTT providers here. In the end, the way you talk about something represents your own point of view as well, and represents the point of view you want other people to have on it, right? Because you're up here and you're trying to discuss it with them. And you clearly have a point of view. And the tricky part is, you might have someone during a Q&A session say stuff like, so it's just like X, but with Y. And that's a little dangerous. That's a little dangerous, and here's why. Because if they say it's just like X, that means they already have X in their head. They're trying desperately to wedge it in there, and they're ignoring what you said. And you could get bogged into, well, it's not exactly like X, and just don't try arguing that point. Come back to what you said. Use your own vocabulary. Use your own words. That's going to help get the point across better. But the biggest one, and this is really hard, the word not. So the tricky part with the word not, at least in American English, is that humans kind of skip over the word not. For example, let's say I'm up here and I say, I absolutely promise not to melt your pet rock. I've made a promise to you. I'm not going to melt your pet rock. But you're going, I didn't even know melting pet rocks was on the table. I didn't even know he knew how to melt a pet rock. How the hell did he know I had a pet rock? And so now they're obsessing about the pet rock you have, clearly, that you love dearly, and that you don't want to do that you don't want anything to happen to, and even though they made a promise they're not going to melt it, well, now you're kind of obsessed about them melting your pet rock. Humans do not hear the word not in discussions like that. Stay away from negative phrases in that regard. Try to stick to positive phrases only. And that might include, maybe you don't talk about the pet rock. There's nothing to talk about. You're not going to melt it. They have no idea you know how to melt it. It's not something you're ever going to do. Why are you talking about the pet rock? As an example. So, words are important, as I hope I've been able to manage to say, and so are promises. You're the adult in the room. Until proven otherwise. When you are up there, when you are up on the podium, I am the expert. Why am I the expert? Not because I know anything more about whiteboarding than you guys do, but more likely because I thought about it more, organized it into a talk, applied for that talk, wrote an abstract, got it accepted by the program committee, thank you program committee, and now I'm up here. And I don't have crippling stage fright, so I'm up here giving a talk because I kind of find it fun. So in that moment, in this time, due to the way that we're all working professionals up here, I am the expert talking about whiteboarding. And so there is this implicit assumption that, well, you are here investing your time on this earth to be here to listen to me because you want to know more about it. And you wouldn't be here unless you thought the person up here was going to be talking a little bit more about it, and hopefully I'm fulfilling that promise. But for any topic you have, if you're the person up here, then people expect you to be the expert. People expect you to keep their promise, that you will not be wasting their time. And so now, I'm going to give you the biggest rule about this talk, the biggest thing that I could possibly tell you about this talk. And if you come away from this talk knowing only one thing and thinking about only one thing about this talk, and you take it to heart, I've done my job. Don't make stuff up. Don't fabricate. Don't be confident, and don't be confident and wrong. Confident and wrong is the worst kind of wrong, and has got us into the most trouble in this world of pretty much anything. There's probably something to say here about how if you have something that is something that models a large language and can write out plausible things, it will sound both confident and be wrong. But that's for another discussion for another day. So if we talk about this, so don't make stuff up, right? You're like, I'm an upstanding individual. I would never make stuff up. I would never, ever fabricate in front of an audience who is trusting me, to say useful educational things. Well, that's fair, right? But people can do it intentionally. People can do it unintentionally, I should say. And here's what that means. Let me mechanically walk you through how that happens. You're up here, you're giving a talk. You're giving a talk, you're doing your thing, Q&A comes, maybe it's a smaller group, so Q&A is happening during the talk, that's fine. And you're saying, okay, and you get a question. And it's a question you are rock solid on the answer to. 100%. And give the answer. Gold star. Good call. Sounds great. You've done your job so far. Then you get the follow-up. Well, maybe there's something that you read about a couple of weeks ago and it's a little bit down deeper into the weeds, but you're pretty sure of the answer. You're like 95% sure. And 19 to 1 odds are still sounding pretty good. And you answer that first one well, and you're the subject matter expert, so what the hell? And you answer that one correctly too. Good for you. Then you get the third follow-up question, because people tend to drill down. And now there's something that you thought of maybe a few months ago. And it's a minuscule detail you're not 100% sure of. But you're a gigantic nerd. And that means you're in a nerd fight right now, whether you know it or not. And you're feeling pretty good about yourself because you just answered 2 questions correctly and it's quiz time and this is the bonus round. And so now you answer something where you're only 75% correct. And if it's not that, and even if you get that question right, the one after that you might not. And so on and so forth. And pretty soon you get to a point where you are both confident and wrong. And at best, people walk away. People walk away and, or at best, people call you out on it right there and you've lost all your credibility. At worst, people go back, use that information, they go back to wherever they were, use that information propagates, and now a whole bunch of people have made mistakes because they trusted you. And now you've lost credibility all over the place. And that's incredibly damaging. Do not make stuff up. It's never worth it. But you're not going to be 100% sure about everything all the time. That's life. So what can you do? Well, when you get to that second question, that 95% question, just say, I'm 95% sure about this one. I read it a couple of days ago. I remember it from doing it here, blah, 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 blah. Qualify it however you want. And I believe, and I'm pretty sure, like nearly 100% sure, but not quite, the answer is this. And people will take that because it still means you did your homework, you thought about it, and you're willing to admit you're not 100% sure, and it means that they're going to be maybe a little bit careful, but you've still educated them. You have still taught them how to do stuff, and they'll just be a little bit careful. Or more importantly, you put it on them. And for that 75% question, sometimes it's like, so I'm really not sure about this one, but this is the way I think it will go and why I think it'll go that way. Or alternately, if you're really not sure, it's a 40% question. You say, hey, that's a great question. I'm sure I have some of the background on it, but I don't want to give you a wrong answer. Let me get back to you on that. Let me talk with you about that afterwards. Maybe put it in a parking lot, right? Everybody's familiar with parking lot. Parking lot is this little bit of the board right here where you put the stuff that you want to talk about later or you hope people forget about, but they never ever do. So parking lots are useful. in some ways. Number one, it means that you can park a question. It means that you can get back to the track you were talking on. That's fabulous. That's pretty great. But the problem is a parking lot is also a promise. A parking lot is a promise that you will learn whatever they need to learn in order to do this topic. You will respond in full to them at some point in the near future, and that you'll respond to them for every follow-on question they have about it. That's an obscene amount of time. And so if you imagine you start putting like 4 things, 5 things, 6 things in there, I'm going to spend work days answering questions about this 1-hour talk. That's crazy. That doesn't mean parking lots are bad. It doesn't mean they're evil, but it means that they should be used judiciously. But now we got to talk about something that's a lot more magical, and it also tends to live in this corner of the board. Put that back up there. There. The agenda. Here's what we're going to talk about during this meeting. I know a bunch of you have probably had rules about, you get on a call, or there's a call with no meeting. Okay, if there's no agenda, don't have to go to that meeting. I've heard that in various office cultures. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, fine, whatever. But for a discussion, having these things on green doesn't show up very well. Okay, I'll use a different marker. The thing about an agenda, first, it keeps you on track, right? Once again, we're humans. We like telling stories. We go all over the place if we're not thinking about it really hard. That's what rehearsal is for. Have an agenda, drive the agenda. That's what you wanted to talk about, remember? And stick to the agenda. If you get dragged off it, come back to it. But the great thing about agendas is not just to have them, because that's useful, but you can blame agendas, and that's pretty great. Hey, that's a great question, but we got a lot to cover. I'm sorry, it's not me, it's the agenda that I wrote on the board. But there you go. We got a lot to cover. We'll just get back to it. Thank you, that's a great question. We'll talk about it later. And then or maybe, if we have time at the end, we'll deal with it. If not, talk to me afterwards. But by having an agenda at all, any agenda, it means that everybody, once again, social norms, everybody agrees to go back on track. Or at least you hope you do. Now, another thing, since we're kind of talking about controlling the conversation a little bit, is invocation. Now, once again, what did I say to you when you came in this morning? This afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. We're going to talk about Whiteboarding 101. Okay. That set up the frame for we're having this lecture, as I mentioned before. Similarly, when I end this talk, we're going to say, I might say something, okay, thank you all for coming, end of the lecture, after Q&A, blah, blah, blah. Thank you all for coming. And that means you're now out of that mode, and you go back to whatever you were doing. And a different set of social norms is in place. Invocation and dispersal are incredibly important to humans. Humans use them all the time. Ask any spiritual leader about how important they are. That's part of our brains. That's part of what we do. Use it. So we're now at halftime. So what I'm going to do right now, so first, so that was the end of that unit. We're going to take a 5-minute break. So be back here by, let's say, 10:02. And check your email, do whatever you got to do, and then we'll have a 3-minute Q&A, and then we'll finish with the rest of the discussion. Thank you. See you later. The green marker is not going to work well. I'm going to have to go back to like the black marker. That's fine. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Ta-da! So anyway, there we go. Oh yeah, no. It's an interesting one, and I couldn't answer you in 5 seconds. We're gonna start again in about 1 minute. Two, and we're back. So, second half of the talk. I want to give you 3 minutes here for Q&A. Do you have any people who want to ask questions?
Hi, my name is Eric. I'm with Geek.
Okay.
First question, just kind of a funny one. You said at the very beginning that you had previously rehearsed, but did you rehearse saying that you had previously rehearsed? And if so, when did the cycle start?
So, as it turns out, since we live in the physical world, at some point, the saying that I rehearsed shrunk down to a single atom, and after that, it was nothingness. So that's the answer to your question.
My actual question then is, do you have any tricks for evading the parking lot without sounding like you just don't want to answer questions?
So there's a couple of things you can do. It's a great question. So I will say again, you don't want to evade the parking lot, right? But just put boundaries on what you're willing to answer. And that might be afterwards, because if you have the needy coworker who is going to ask you questions forever, and because you answer their question, they're now your friend, and you really don't want them to be your friend. Let's be clear, that's probably what you're talking about, because I'm smart, is what you want to do. I see the laughing over there. Okay, so in the end, you can say, hey, look, that's a great question. It's a little bit out of scope for this talk. It's a little bit out of scope for this talk. I'll be glad to point you at something later that might actually be able to answer your questions. You point them at a reference. And, that's nice than saying, go read a book. But, it basically gets the same point across. It's like, that's a great question. It's a little bit off this topic. I can recommend, and then your obligation to that person is to point them at a couple of relevant references. Don't say RTFM, that's not nice. But point them at a couple of relevant references, and then if you have any further questions after you read those, get back to me. Which is, maybe you want to say, look, don't waste my time. But the reality is, sometimes the answer is, please don't waste my time. You really need to do homework. And so that's one of the ways that I get it. Like pointing people at relevant references, and that means doing enough homework to know what the relevant references are, is useful. And they will thank you for that just the same.
Okay.
Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Any other questions before we continue? All right. So, next I want to talk about letting the audience in. I'm the speaker, you're the audience. When you ask a question, like the question that was just asked to me, or the questions that were just asked to me. By the way, I commend the person who asked the question because they asked a question, the question had a question mark at the end of it. That's one of the hallmarks of a question, by the way. And I thank you for all of that. By letting the audience in, what do I mean? I mean, how do you make sure that they are invested in the talk? How do you make sure that they are actually absorbing what's in the talk? And how do they know that you are listening to them when you get to the point of the talk, when you get to talk with them? So here's a couple of things. Here's a couple of tricks for that. Number one, when someone comes up and asks a question, It's going to sound obvious, I'm warning you right now. Listen to the words of the question. Not listen to the question. They're clearly asking a question. They're standing in front of the mic and they're asking a question. Listen to the words of the question. Everybody wants to be right. Everybody wants to know that, hey, I'm halfway through your question. I know exactly what your answer is. I'm just going to turn off my brain right now, let you make mouth noises, and then I'll answer your question when you're done making mouth noises. And that's a very good way to show the audience that you don't care a damn about them and that you're only furthering what you thought was the question. Because I promise you, more often than not, the question they ask has very little to do with the I should say, doesn't have very little. It has almost enough to do with the question in your head to be relevant. But it's probably not the same question. The way that you show the audience that you care, which means they're going to think about the stuff that you told them more thoroughly, is by listening to the exact question they asked. Now, it may be a question to which you do not want to give a direct answer, but you won't know that unless you listen to all of the words of the question. The other thing, once again, you get a free pair of ears of your brain. What is their tone of voice? Do they sound like they're losing patience? Do they sound like they're engaged? Do they sound like they want to start a free-form nerd fight? What do they want to do? What is their attitude? What is their posture right then? You get to detect that, and you get to think about that. And even if you're not good at that, even if that's not something you're really good at, by listening to all the words and processing them, you can get to where you need to get next. Listen to all of the words of the question. In addition, this is actually a kind of cool trick. I forget who I learned it from, but it's utterly brilliant. If you have a whole lot of people in a room, it's going to be kind of tricky to gauge the audience. And I mean, you can kind of defocus your eyes, but you're trying to give a talk here, and you can't like gauge the temperature of everybody in this room. But what you can do is choose 3 proxies. Say right, middle-ish, left. That you shift between, and you can shift who those people are every now and then. But you're scanning the room and looking in 3 places. And just going back and forth and looking at those people. Number 1, by looking at, so here's one fun thing about humans. By looking at a person, people around them think you're looking at them too, from a distance. So you're making eye contact for free, which is kind of great. But also, it means that, say, okay, if person on the right is bored, that section's kind of bored. That person's really engaged, this section's engaged. This person's pissed off, this whole thing is pissed off. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not, but it's going to be true more often than not. And it's a quick way to sift information in your brain while you're doing something that's very high cognitive load, that being trying to get information out to other people while you're standing on stage with a mic. So choose 3 proxies. That's going to help you a lot too. So a word about, so one thing that I want to also mention here is, because we get into audiences and audience energy and what have you, and things get very weird, is let's talk about remote work. Since around March 2020, the reality of a whole bunch of our surroundings is that we're stuck on Zoom calls all the bloody time. I'm not going to go into Zoom call etiquette all that much, or whatever other provider you tend to use for telecom. I don't really care. The important thing here I want to cover is how to give a talk remotely. Now, there are whiteboard tools. I mean, Miro is the one that I remember, but there are whiteboard tools you can give. There are whiteboard tools you can use and scribble on. But even then, it is a tool. Tools must be practiced with to be used. Hey, I'm just going to give it a whiteboard and I'll get like a Wacom tablet or something. Just got it off from a retailer the other day, and I'm going to look at this thing, I'm going to do the thing. And then you start doing it live in front of people without having ever practiced with it. without having ever figured out anything more complicated than to turn it on, and suddenly, why does my handwriting look weird? Why can't I figure out how to do this? How did I switch to the other screen? What did I click? And suddenly it all goes bad. Learn your tools, use your tools. But the one specific, and so a specific tip, if you are the presenter, learn where the mute all button is. Be able to click it with your eyes closed, behind your back, what have you. Or at the very least, put a big post-it note on your monitor saying, click the mute all button before starting. That's probably the easiest. Why? I think we all know why. I'm not even going to describe it, with the exception of saying crosstalk wastes a tremendous amount of time. Think about every time you've been on a video conference call like that, and two people talk over each other. It's like Ethernet, CSMACD, right? You talk, there's a collision, people back off, then they try talking again, there's a collision, they back off a little bit more. And you can spend 7 to 8 seconds it's a long time. You can spend 7 to 8 seconds backing off of talking with each other just so that one person can talk. Now think about how many times that happens during a call. Think about how many times that happens during a 30-minute call. You could be wasting 2 minutes, 3 minutes just having people talk back and forth. Sometimes that's inevitable. But when you're a presenter, it's even worse, because especially if you're presenting to a large amount of people and somebody leaves themselves unmuted and say they're yelling to somebody in the other room, or the dog comes in, or whatever, right? That's life. Humans have life happen around them. That's cool. But you can take the precaution of muting everybody. Make sure you mute everybody. This also means that people don't feel like, hey, this is an interactive conversation. There's information you have to impart. You will open the floor for questions and answers. It's a way to enforce that social norm in a way that they don't really have it. The other thing, which is a failure mode of using virtual whiteboards, it's like, hey, this is awesome. I got my virtual whiteboard. This is great. I'm going to set up my whole talk beforehand. All right, check this out. I'm going to have a virtual whiteboard here, and a virtual whiteboard here, and a virtual whiteboard here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and here. And I'm going to switch between them, and I'm going to draw on each of them. You've now made a slide deck with extra steps. You've now made something that is somehow worse than PowerPoint. Because now you have to zoom out, zoom back in, fiddle with the tool, and fiddling with the tool is definitely not part of your talk. Okay, I gotta zoom out of that, where'd I put it? Oh, I put it over there, okay, I'll go to that one now. And then maybe you draw on it a little bit, or you don't, because have you rehearsed how you're gonna draw on that slide? Have you decided what you're gonna do? If not, that's just PowerPoint animation. Choose the right medium. If you have a whiteboard talk, use the whiteboard like a whiteboard. Draw on it. Avoid being fancy and zooming in and out. That's not cognitive load that you have. But, that being said, if there's cases where there's a couple of very complex diagrams that you want to annotate, figure 1 and figure 2, there's nothing wrong with using those as visual aids to get to. It's like, I'm going to flip over this and then start annotating this diagram. That's great. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But just remember that don't make it like a slide presentation, except worse. Because I've seen that way too much, and it doesn't help anybody, and people will start longing for PowerPoint. Don't make people do that. In addition, back what I said about invocation dispersal before, even more important in Zoom calls. Even more important. Hello, thank you all for coming. You've muted everybody, right? Here's what we're going to talk about today. I'll open up for questions at the end of this talk. Please keep your questions till then. If you have questions you want to put in the chat, we'll deal with them later. Best thing, people can parking lot themselves by putting stuff in the chat. And the great thing is, other people in the chat may already answer their questions. So just please put stuff in the chat. If people don't get to those, we'll get to them at the end of the talk. Thank you very much. Here we go. So use the chat feature to your advantage. Use mute all to your advantage. Don't make a PowerPoint presentation except worse with your whiteboarding tools. Practice using your tools. So what I want to talk now a little bit since this comes up every time, standard Geek pitfalls. We're all working professionals. Most of us are a bunch of nerds. I'm pretty clear on that one. I have to be honest with myself. And I hope that you all are honest with yourselves too. But that also means that we have a way of discussing technical detail. And the way that we will discuss technical detail among friends in a friendly way is not the way that you give a talk. Especially a talk where there's questions, because the people in the audience who ask questions, well, they might be very nice people, but they're not your friends, right? They are people in the audience who have questions. So in this particular case, from the speaker point of view, and I know that when I was in Akamai Professional Services, this is one of the things that happens to everybody who's a newbie in Akamai Professional Services. The way it works, actually, I don't know if they still do it, is when you get hired in, you go through a boot camp, you go through a course of stuff, but you also go through the whiteboards. The whiteboards are, okay, you're going to give a talk on this topic to a group of people, and at the end of this talk, you will get a Q&A, and then we'll tell you whether you passed or failed, depending upon how well you covered the material and how well you know the material and how well you fielded the questions. Pretty much everybody fails their first whiteboard on their first topic because nobody knows really how to give one if they're starting out. And a lot of what people do is they derail themselves. They don't know what's relevant, they haven't rehearsed, they haven't thought about it, and therefore they just start throwing knowledge at the audience. Hey, I know everything. If I throw everything at them, they'll think I know that I know everything, and that means I passed the whiteboard, right? No. Never, actually. All you've done is lost the audience, and everybody in that room who's listening to you has done the exact same thing you did when they were standing up there. And this goes for any talk, really. Where if someone's like, I'm lost, I don't know what to do, I'm just going to throw knowledge at the audience and hope they understand me, because I want them to like me. And that's a problem, because now nobody can follow you. You've probably broke out of the abstraction levels you wanted to, and now everybody's lost, including you, and you don't even feel good about it, because you know you're not giving them what they wanted. You can't give yourself what you wanted, and it all goes bad. And they're going to notice if you throw up a smoke screen. Just don't do it. It's good for drinks with your friends. It's bad for an audience. Another one is, so the tricky part, once again, we're all kind of opinionated. And it's hard for anybody, taking things personally. If you take things personally, is the, hey, they're you know, I want to get into a one-on-one nerd fight with this person again. No, they're just asking you a question. It's cool. They're asking you a question. They're not trying to stump the chump. This is not a quiz show. This is a lecture that you are giving, and someone has a legitimate question. Yes, there are bad faith actors. No, that's not most people, not even them. And we're going to get into handle those people by the end of this talk, I promise. But you have to understand that the question is about the topic. The question is not about your knowledge of the topic. And so getting defensive if you don't know doesn't make sense. Everybody in the audience is willing to spend their time on this planet being here, which means they want you to succeed. So if the answer is you legitimately don't know, just say so. Hey, that's a great question. I don't want to give you a wrong answer. Hey, I'm not 100% confident of the answer there. Let me follow up with you afterwards. And so on. But saying, hey, I never talked about it that way. I don't know what you're talking about. I never said that in this talk. I don't know where you're going from. And now suddenly, it's not you, the lecturer, speaking to an audience, but you're just some person up on stage having an argument with one other person over. You're just one person standing up on a raised platform having an argument with another person. You've just reduced your stature by doing that. And that isn't good for you or them. Just don't do it. And this also goes for getting into the weeds, right? Going into the little nerdy details of something is totally your comfort. It's totally, it's my comfort zone. It's probably a lot of people's comfort zones. Hey, here's this domain knowledge I have, and I want to share it with you because I like you, and therefore I want to share my knowledge with you. But when you walked into this room, and these people walked into this room, they consented to you giving a talk with a certain level of abstraction. And if you break out below that level of abstraction, now you have broken your promise to them. Now, that doesn't mean they're suddenly going to think of you as a horrible individual, but they're just not going to be interested in the talk anymore, and it's not the talk you wanted to give anyway. It's a comfort zone, but the goal is to give a talk, not to be comfortable. Another one is this one? Yeah. Breaking the flow of the talk with details. Yeah, there's always going to be sidebars. There's always going to be things that you're going to say that are parenthetical comments about, hey, there's this thing, and I'll say it in one sentence, I'll move on. However, if your entire talk is stacked in parentheses, and everything's a parenthetical comment, and everything is another fun fact that's going to be popped up next to whatever you're going to be talking about, people are going to lose the thread of what you actually wanted to talk about in the first place. They're just not going to know. So I strongly recommend, make sure that suppress the urge to say something parenthetical. Suppress the urge to add in that one additional detail because you think it's a fun fact. If it's something you wanted to include in the talk because it's interesting and it's part of the talk, make sure it's intentionally in there. There should be very few times where you start ad-libbing details. And that similarly goes for jumping from topic to topic. Human brains are associative machines. Hey, that reminds me of a thing that reminds me of a thing that reminds me of a thing that reminds me of a thing. But the way that you know a topic is not necessarily the best way to teach people a topic. Because the way that you are wired to understand a topic has nothing to do with the way that it may be worthwhile to start if you're starting from zero. You've arranged things in your brain appropriately, but that's probably not how it started out when you were getting taught it yourself. And now, yeah, we're on time. Good. Since I have a feeling that this is kind of the bit of the talk that a whole bunch of you wanted to see anyway, and hopefully you got stuff out of the other part of the talk. Dealing with problem audience members. We have them. You've probably seen a bunch of them. There's a reason that there's a little sign hanging on that mic over there. There's a little sign hanging on that mic over there saying, make sure you're asking a question. because there are plenty of people who do not. And we'll get to that in a second. Let me go through a couple of others first. So first big one is the sniper. This is, you're in a room, you got a lot of people in the room, someone will be saying side comments over to somebody, hey, that's really stupid. Or, yeah, I did it with it the other day. Let me tell you all about it. Or, I did that better than he did it. Or whatever, things along those lines. Or just snide side comments about something like, whatever, we're not going to get into it. The point is, these people exist. Now, what's the thing, right? They want to comment, but they don't want to participate, right? They want attention. They want to get attention for themselves, but they don't actually want the attention of the greater crowd there. They want attention. They want attention from their peers. They want approval by the people sitting next to them. And maybe they say something funny and they get a little hit of dopamine out of that. And, this will be someone typically who's making commentary to their neighbors and not even particularly whispering. Because side conversations do happen in talks. Hey, a couple of humans are saying, okay, like, hey, did you understand what he meant? Oh yeah, he was talking about the other thing. Okay, cool. And that's 3 seconds of conversation for 2 people to sync on what the person up there talking about meant. And then it's over. Just let that slide. That's going to happen all the time. It doesn't mean anything. It actually probably helps you. Just let it slide. But when there's multiple side conversations, when there's only supposed to be one person talking, just shut it down. Similarly, if it's a prolonged conversation, say, hey, if you need to talk about that, can you go out of the room? We're talking about this in here and I need to get through this material. We need to all talk about this. So the answer is, what do you do with a sniper? You got somebody in the room, they're trying to talk about things. And the answer is, you give them the attention they want. Hi, how you doing? You like to share with the class, Tommy? And now suddenly, they are like, go up to the mic. If you had a question, we'd love to hear it. I'm not very kind in that regard. We got a question, we'd love to hear it. Please come up to the mic. You're clearly talking to a whole bunch of people. Please, we want to know. Oh no, I had nothing. Oh really? Okay. And typically they will just then slink off into the back of the room, probably to leave. Or they might slink off back to the seat in silence, and they stay in silence. I've never had that not happen. On the other hand, shining the attention on somebody immediately when you see them habitually doing that, because you can kind of scan the room and you can see it, it pretty much always works. And it's, a little bit of fun, not gonna lie. Sniper. Give the attention they don't want. The next one is the bully. There's a person who is having a mimetic immune response to whatever you said. They're like, you said something that was wrong. You're not only wrong on the internet, you're wrong on life. You're right here, you are wrong, sir. And Mr. Wrongington, I need to correct you right now, Mr. Wrong. Thank you, Tim. And so Mr. Wrongington needs to be corrected because they're wrong, and they're in here, and so I can correct them because they're wrong. And I've got a mic right there that means I can correct them. And they will get all sorts of mad and aggro at you. And now they might even phrase it in the form of a question, which means you can't get around it as easily. But usually they're just going to start yelling. It's like, I don't believe anything you said about this. And you just wait for them to finish. More specifically, isolate. Do not escalate. Because in the end, do not escalate. Because a bully loses their power when they are alone. That happens in the playground, that happens in a talk. if you just wait for them to, if they're just yelling into the mic, well, if they just keep going forever, you can just cut the mic. And then I say AV people will help you with that. But if they're just going and then they're kind of burning themselves out, let them. They'll look like an idiot in front of all their friends and professional colleagues. And then you can wait until they get to silence. It takes only a few seconds. Say, did you have a question? And as they realize exactly what has just happened to them, they will either have a question that is completely anodyne because they're up at the mic and they need to ask a question, or they'll take the L and go away. Isolate, do not escalate. Do not yell back to a bully. Do not take it personally. It's not about you. It's about this person wanting to feel like I have the answer and I need to correct somebody who is wrong. So a kind of hybrid of both of those is called the status seeker. They don't even want to actually an answer to their question. They just want to be the smartest person in the room. And you know, they might be, right? You're just up here giving this talk because you thought about it really hard. But you thought about it really hard. But they want to be known as very, very smart. And so the best case there is to recognize them and defer. Say, hey, that's a great question. It's a little bit out of scope for this talk, but I'll be glad to talk with that. That's a really, really insightful question, and I hear what you're saying. Let's talk about it afterwards. Well, now you've given the approval they so desperately crave in front of their peers, and they didn't want an answer to that question anyway. They just wanted the approval, and you've given them a verbal pat on the head, and they move away. This also works surprisingly well. And then, my favorite, our favorite, Nakmok. Just love how it sounds Klingon, it's great. If anybody's ever heard of the author John Scalzi, this actually comes from him. Nakmok stands for not a question, more of a comment. Now you've probably heard that you've seen these on stage, right? That's right, and that sign's right there. So like, and they all start with like, this isn't a question, but blah, 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 blah. Wouldn't the panel or speaker agree that blah, 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 blah. I was wondering if blah, blah, blah. Stop them. Cut them off. If they're rambling, have them cut the mic. I'm not kidding. Your audience doesn't want to hear them. Your audience does not care about that person who wants to have a conversation with you right now. They're not learning anything from this person rambling about their talk. You're the one up here, they're not. They want to give a talk, they can rehearse, they can prepare, they can apply, they can stand up, and they can absorb questions from people just like them. I have no tolerance for people who do that, and I encourage you to not have any tolerance for those people either. A question ends in a question mark. I'll even typically give you, one sentence for context. That's fair. Like a sentence for context, a sentence for the question. And if it's something that's actually germane to the talk, I might even be more forgiving than that. But in the end, it has to be short and it has to be relevant. If they're just there to ramble and they just want to give a point and they didn't even think about the point they wanted to make, cut them off. Hey, I'm sorry, sir, did you have a question? Did you have a question? Did you have a question? Question. If the answer is no, then there you go. And the answer is, please hold it for later, I'll be glad to talk with you. And they probably won't show up. If they just keep going and ignore you, cut the mic. Sir, we have time for questions right now. If you don't have a question, please sit down. And now they're embarrassed, and now it's they can either double down or they can just sit down. And inevitably they will. So, thank you very, very much for coming to this talk. We have about 3.5 minutes for Q&A. So, have that.
Great talk. Thank you very much.
Don't do that. Mic drops are not cool. What's up? Yeah, I know. That's why I don't drop them. Yeah.
Do you have a recommended online whiteboard tool that works well, or set of tools that work well?
So that's okay. So what I'll say is that's not coming through the mic. The mic or the mic. He's going to give you another mic. The mic is the room's ears. That's what's going to show up on the recording. I know you mean well. Talk through the mic.
Do you have a recommended online whiteboarding tool that you've found works well?
So I will say I have used. I mean, vendor recommendations are not a thing that happens here, but I will say that I have used Miro, and with the Miro, and it's worked pretty well. It is, it's a Unity app. It's a bit of a CPU hog, but it does the job. And I've used it with typically, I have like a Wacom graphics tablet that I've used, got for like a couple of $100, and that was just fine. And it got the job done. Any other question? Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, great. Any other questions? Please get to the mic.
Ryan Hamill, i3D/Ubisoft. I was going to add to that and say Excalidraw.
Okay.
There are other alternatives like that I've gotten. If you like just basic drawing shapes or writing things and doing quick stuff, because I found that like if you're using Miro, like my employer does, you can get very crazy with it, or you can do very minimal.
Yep.
But it also has a bit more of a learning curve compared to Excalidraw. It all depends on what your needs and wants are.
Oh, certainly. Also, I will also add ASCII Draw, which is really fun if you want to actually like do stuff with straight up ASCII diagrams, and actually draw a box with stuff that can be exported to ASCII. It's kind of great. Any other questions? All right. Thank you all very, very much for your time.
Thanks, Matt. That was fantastic. Thank you again for everyone for coming.